Hey guys, so in the spirit of making sure that you are as procedurally equipped as possible, I thought it was pretty relevant to show you how I'm going to go about modeling the spots for analyzing the different turn and river variations when we're doing something like check calling turn in this 3-bet line and then facing a river barrel. That's where we left off in the last one, and if you remember, we were looking at this King of Diamonds lock. The problem that I brought up, or sort of the annoying part about PioSolver, is that there is no way to run simulations for locking our entire range across every single turn. So if we're going to go in and do it as far as studying grids, or even if we're going to do it by pumping out an aggregation, we have to manually lock every single turn for the strategy that we want, which is annoying, but right now it's the best that we can work with the program. And quite honestly, I think we're using the program in a more advanced way than even the creators kind of intended. So I think they're sort of behind us, and it might be something that we want to introduce to them in terms of asking them to upgrade that. So you remember I had the King of Diamonds locked, and we went over that in the subsequent nodes, but I want to show you exactly how to do this in a way that makes sure that you don't have any errors in the procedure of it. What I want to do is look at a couple of different turns. So I'm going to change this turn to a 3 of hearts. The first thing that I'm going to do so that our models for get to turn when facing a bet are as sort of applicable as possible, formidable as possible to what our actual strategy will look like, since we are going to be checking range in this card, is I'm going to check range for this node. So we know how to do that. I'm going to go to fixed, and I'm locked. Now, if I check here and I were to solve the model as is, you guys know that this will iterate in position for his maximal exploit strategy. We don't want that. We want to keep his strategy fixed for playing something that the environment will play as far as like a straightforward strategy. We're doing that basically because it's the most relevant application of the modeling. It's the least assumptive, considering that these guys are not playing MES strategies versus they're kind of playing their own system. So it might be something that's worth looking into. Like I have a different model down here that I was solving for in position's maximal exploit on the 3 of hearts if he knew that we checked range, and he'll check back something like 72% of the time. That would be his maximal exploit strategy. So it's something that you can start to open up in terms of open up his lock. If for some reason you saw a few regs at your limit that maybe had caught on to the fact that you were checking range on certain cards on certain textures, but again, I haven't found it to be a problem. And I play pretty high on softer sites, but I crush. And the reason that I crush is that people are not putting the study into range versus range interaction that I feel like they would need to in order to detect the patterning that I'm using for when I'm checking range and when I'm barreling too much with too much front door aggression. So here's the second mandatory lock. We want to lock him for his entire strategy here. I don't need to go in and shift anything. I'm just going to lock him for what his, we'll call it optimal strategy was, because for all intents and purposes it was optimal for the model we were using for the ranges as they were on the turn. So now we have a model where we're locked for check range on the 3, and he's locked for his optimal when check 2 strategy. The next most, I guess, standard approach or reasonable approach that I almost fell for would be to go into every single node and lock us for 0 raising range. The problem with that is that if I lock that node at 0 raise, I also risk locking the call frequency and the fold frequency, so it won't allow it to iterate. So what I'm actually going to have to do is solve this as is, let it come up with the frequencies that it wants, and then do a manual sort of shift lock, I guess is what I would call it, where I'm not going to resolve the model. I'm just going to shift all of the raises over to the calls, and I'll come back when I do that. So first I'm just going to solve this thing as it is with his when check 2 turn range locked at quote unquote optimal, and we'll be right back. Okay, so I'm solved down to point 1. I think it's important for turn models to go to a lower accuracy exploitability. I think that's pretty intuitive in nature. So at this point, here's the trick, or the trap, I guess, is that if I pick a bet sizing, this is solved, and it's still got the raise included, which I'm not going to be using with the simplified system that I'm playing. So the natural inclination would be to just lock each of these raise options for every single one of his betting options to 0, and to just view the models that way. Here's the problem. I'm going to show you by doing it the way that I think most people would go about doing it. So I'm going to set the strategy to lock the node for a 0% raise in each of the facing each of the bet sizing options that in position could use. By sliding it to 0, it automatically places it in the next most relevant node or domain, I guess. It's smart enough to know that a raise doesn't turn into a fold, which is cool. We're not going to need to do the raise for his 831 option because there's no check raise option for us there. So the last one is just versus the half pot bet. So I'm actually pretty impressed here because from what I just looked after I paused, it doesn't seem like there's a need to do it my way. What I thought would happen, and what I thought happened in the past, I don't know if he upgraded the version, is that when I throw a river down and I have him moving all of his raises over to calls with the node lock, I didn't think that that would carry over to this node. In other words, I thought that the hands that were raising would be exited still from the turn call. So I thought we were going to have to resolve it from there, but we don't. The model seems to refresh itself automatically without even having to go through another iteration of solving, which is really helpful because it saves us solver time. So now we can check it, for instance, if the river is like a deuce of diamonds, and see out of position has all of his range still intact from flop c bet, all of his pairs that he decided to check call turn with. So he would go and check, and then in position is still value betting the optimal range, which is what we want, because if we resolved it, in position would now play a much tighter value betting range. That's not what we want because we want the best environmental representation. So in position bets, and you can see that this is what our calling range would be. So we'll get into this in more depth, but I just wanted to go over this because I thought there was going to be a bigger glitch than there ended up being, but it looks like Pio is making this easier on us than I thought, and it's actually less necessary for us to be as precise with the way that we go about locking and solving as we go down the line. So we're going to go back and work with the locked King of Diamonds first. We're going to look at some different rivers, look at some bluffing distribution base rate differentiations for in position after he decides to bet the turn and we check call. And then we're going to go back to the three of hearts and look at how it sort of interacts differently when there's a different turn card and different river cards, because that's generally how we are solving this paradox of not being able to like hyper accurately control our mixed strategy frequencies. Instead, we're looking for relevant solutions for using more resourceful avenues, and the most resourceful avenue I've found is using this idea of range versus range interaction to identify base rate deviations in villains bluffing frequency. So I'm going to get more into detail as to why I think that's the best way to go about it and the least assumptive way to go about it in terms of your river bluff catching. But first I want to show you guys this thing. If you remember in the last video I said that there was a note on the side of the comment box. I hope everybody read it. It was pertaining to the fact that we're not trying to place some sort of naive 1 minus A, some sort of naive NDF in the process of playing this check range. And I made that note that it's important to understand that mandatory defense frequency is the effect of solver already iterating for how many plus EV hands it can make as a call or a raise. MDF is not just some set number that already exists. It is the product of solver iterating to an equilibrium. So what I wanted to show you guys is what your check call range here will look like after checking range, which is what we have locked here, compared to the optimal model. So what I'm pulling up right now is the optimal model where we actually have a c-bet frequency on the turn. This is with in position having the same calling range. King comes down on the turn, and out of position is playing a 22% barreling frequency here. You can see he's doing stuff like always betting king 4-2 pair and having front door aggression strategies with his strong ace-x and stuff is the main value region. He's barreling the set of nines. So I'm going to compare our out of position check call strategy versus most common strategic betting option, which in this spot is 174. Notice that for these two models, since I've locked in position for his quote unquote optimal bet one check two range or optimal one check two strategy, these two strategies for him are exactly the same. You can see he's checking 49.8% in both of them. So I'm going to use the 174 sizing here too. You're going to see that our calling frequency here is 54%. Basically, we still have all of that ace queen, king four spade, ace king, all of our pocket nines. Whereas here, when he bets 174, we're more like defending 51%, it looks like. So we're defending slightly more. In some models where and in models where we're barreling exploitatively, it's possible we'll be defending even more than that. One thing this doesn't take into account is like if the turn were a 4, our turn check call would probably deviate quite a bit in terms of what the optimal recommendation would be, depending on how aggressive we got with how many bluffs we wanted to unload exploitatively in that front door line. Because remember, that was the main sort of tactical ace that I gave for certain cards on this texture, is that when the paired cards came down, it was primarily the ace and the 9, it put a lot of pressure on his MDF to be barreling. So I'm just sort of showing this as a procedural technique where you can sort of check how your check calling range in practice will deviate from the solver calling ranges. And I don't want you guys to be so concerned necessarily about maybe having really high check call frequencies on certain textures, because one thing that will happen with this system is that your frequencies will press themselves out kind of naturally. I think overall your turn check call will be high because on average we're going to be barreling a little bit more aggressively, probably substantially more aggressively across the subset of all possible turns. But for the most part, you always have that option of falling back on getting closer to balance by just check folding some more mixed strategy hands in your range at this point. When you do check and face a bet, and you only really need to worry about that versus villains who you think are aware enough of your turn check call strategies or overall statistical deviations that it makes sense to start to adjust versus them. I really haven't found that that's a problem. It might become a problem upwards of like 1k NL on PokerStars, but it's one of those problems where we're going to cross that bridge when we get to it, and you probably have a long sample before that even becomes an issue. So we're training for decision power, and a big part of decision power is training for relevance. So if there's exploits available, we are going to pretty much pile in on those exploits, get the win rate out of them that we can, and keep an overarching awareness over our environment, because we are capable of detecting when people are taking strategies against us. And I think that's the main thing that the community has this paranoia about, is that they don't want to do anything too unsustainable because of the fact that they could be detected. But what I'm recommending is that these strategies are subtle enough that I think they go relatively undetected in nature. And at the point at which someone did detect them, their counter strategies are not all that simple in the first place. Because, for instance, if we're talking about a strategy or a system where we're barreling too much on the turn, pretty much across the board, if that's our major deviation, is that we're bluffing too much on the turn, which is making our checking range pretty much value heavy and our check call goes up. One of the main ways somebody would have to exploit us in the turn is start calling very wide. That's a very uncomfortable exploit for anybody who's not operating on a very high level of range versus range interaction understanding. They're having to float stuff like ace highs a ton and like king queen high a ton on an ace high board, all of their low pocket pairs. That would be the maximum exploitative strategy on the turn versus somebody who knew who was barreling recklessly. So not only are their exploits very advanced and uncomfortable, but our strategies overall in terms of how we are surgically applying our aggression are well thought out and pretty much precise and undetectable enough that they don't really know what we're doing on any given texture, because we're not the type of player who always plays in the same way. We will be having value that goes front door on a lot of different textures, like the one that we'll look at next in this video. It's just that this is a unique texture where we are always checking range. So I want to just mention it to sort of ease your guys' paranoia, because I know it seems a little bit crazy that I'm recommending that we use only a bluffing frequency for 3 different turn cards here, like the ace, the 9, and the 4. And for a lot of guys, that might be, I'm too big of a leap already to trust me on that, but I have had great results with being abusive in those types of spots, and I would ask that you do trust me, and if you're not comfortable with it, maybe don't implement strategies that are, or tactical laces that are that intense to begin with. But know that I have tested these, and the data results for the mass database reviews are supporting that people are intensely overfolding to turn barrel in this line across the board, and that these are the spots where I have high confidence that their MDF is quite challenged. So that's why I'm advocating that we take such an intense exploit in that spot. So just more procedural lacing, and I think what I'm saying about the front door aggression strategies and our overall system converging towards something that is much more undetectable will make sense when we look at a different texture. Like the next one we're going to look at is a 9 high board. It's like 9-5 deuce. And on that one, we'll look at a lot of overcards where out of position is at more of a range advantage across more turns, at least more of a range advantage than he is on this board where he's at a pretty big deficit. He's still not going to be pushing equity for the most part, but his overall c-bet frequency on the turn is higher, and for that reason we have more incentive to start balancing turn value bets, because we're losing too much accuracy at that point to just do stuff like check range. So when we get into that, I think you guys will have more confidence that it's going to be harder to detect what we're doing unless a villain really has studied Pack 2 and has clairvoyance over our system, and that should give you more confidence in applying these exploitative strategies more or less fearlessly. So one thing that we should sort of already be thinking about is that because of the fact that we are checking range on, well, this specific turn, for instance, which is the first one we're going to look at, and the fact that we're check calling more aggressively than optimal solver would on account of having a stronger checking range to begin with, is that our river check call range is going to be substantially stronger than what an optimal one would look like. Now here is something that is important, and it's important enough that I'm going to go ahead and resolve the model at this point of the notes. I'm going to have bet 174. We're going to play this calling range, and remember how I said that it did carry over and it allowed us to go into the checking line with the hands that we were check calling from the turn. The problem is that we have a donking range to the river that it wants to play because our check call turn was technically too strong enough that it's incentivizing us to play a lead to meet the new equilibrium, because if solver knows that if we don't play this lead, we don't weaken the checking range enough to have him value bet thin enough, and then he checks too often behind and we lose value. So solver's being smart, but we're looking for relevance. So what I'm going to do, and this is I guess sort of the hunch that I had when going into this, that I remember doing this from the past with this type of like donking error when you have strong checking ranges and check calling ranges to the turn, is I'm going to lock here for check range, and then I'm also going to lock for in position to continue to play his optimal river strategy c-bet, because I don't want him changing his c-bet based on the fact that now I'm checking a stronger range, because he's not going to be doing that in practice because he doesn't have clairvoyance over our strategy. So it's as simple as tools, node lock, so now I'm checking all, and then for him I'm just going to lock this river c-bet. So I want to be on the checking node where in the strategy grid his 657 all-in is showing, and I'm just going to lock this entire strategy for him. So now I'm going to run this, and we're going to have very accurate ranges to get to the river with that we can analyze some base rate type bluffing distributions with. Okay, so we're back. We've gotten what we've wanted out of this lock. as far as the check range. We've taken away the donking option, which is how we're going to play it in practice. And we've locked in position for what is actually substantially kind of a lower river barrel. I think it has to do partially with the fact that we gave him the half size turn bet in this line, which is the most common sizing used. I did double check and see when he uses the 2/3 sizing on the turn, he's going to follow through more often here, closer to like 45%. I have aggregational reports, not totally conclusive. Obviously, nothing's really totally conclusive in my world, but we've been seeing across, I think, 167 flop subset, a aggregational trend of approximately 52% river barrel across all textures. Obviously, that deviates a lot from texture to texture, and it's not exactly the most helpful aggregational tool, like I mentioned before, because it doesn't give us insight into how thin the environment is value betting. So if we find out the environment is value betting about 48%, or betting overall at like 48% on the river in this line, which is actually the trend that we found for Bovada 1K, 2K NL, it really doesn't tell us the full story because we don't know if they're value betting thin enough, so we don't know if they're actually bluffing disproportionately high or low. So with this type of thing, what I like to train is for base rate bluffing frequencies, more or less, and that's what we're going to go into now. So we have the optimal value betting range locked for in position here on the river, and what I want to do is go into some different range explorer tendencies for certain river runouts for the King of Diamonds turn, and we're going to explore what rivers give in position the highest base rate of bluffs. So let's start with the two of diamonds first of all. In order to select the range explorer on the right node, we want to be on the check. So this is going to give us pretty much in positions range when he gets to the river, so before betting. If I were to highlight bet, we would see in range explorer the distribution of his betting range, which would be perfectly balanced with, I don't know, maybe 70% value, 30% bluffs. That's not what we want. We want to see how many bluffs he's looking down at when he has the opportunity to make a river bet, because that's what we're concerned with when we're talking about making decisions based on range versus range interaction with regard to base rate bluffs. So I'm going to go into Range Explorer here with that node checked, and I'm exploring in position. It's very important. And on this particular river, I drew up here for different rivers for him, and it'll show us his optimal c-bet frequency. But when we want to look at what our check calling range would be, it's going to be most accurate only for the deuce, because right now we have the deuce locked for no donk for us. So as far as the relevance of exploring his base rate bluffing frequency, we can do it because this is showing us all of his optimal solutions for betting river, which are static and don't rely on us toggling the donk in and out. But if we did want to get more familiar with our bluff catching frequencies, we would have to go in and manually lock no donk on the river, no donk option, for every single river we wanted to look at. The cool thing is, as far as relevance, is that I don't even think that's all that necessary, because I don't study exact river check call grids. What I study is base rate bluff as it pertains to range versus range interaction, and I sort of just do it on the fly from there. And I apply what I have from everything from player notes to timing tells. I'm using basically anything I can get my hands on, bet sizing tells from the turn. So for me, it's more of a putting all the pieces together from the hand on the river, including range versus range interaction knowledge, as opposed to going in and stifling my thought process with just a very rigid, how do I play the most balanced check call strategy so that I'm not exploitable. And I think that's an important note, is that once you guys start to take off as independent thinkers and high caliber decision makers, you will naturally gear your strategies more exploitatively. You won't be as concerned with protecting yourself by playing an MDF. You'll have enough environmental conclusions, semi conclusions, I guess, supportable assumptions, high confidence assumptions, that you can begin to use range versus range interaction tendencies and strategies for bluff catching with more decisiveness and more confidence, and put less emphasis on actually playing perfectly balanced, because it's just not relevant, nor is it possible. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to highlight not only the nothing, in his range, which is the total air, but I'm also going to highlight the low pair because I think that it's weak enough that if somebody were to be like betting pocket fives on the turn, that a lot of times they are at least considering barreling it twice. So it seems like we've got shreds of like sevens, eights, sixes, fives, threes here, and that's what's bringing us up from like 26.4 to 32.2. So I'm just sort of taking a note of that he's got 32% base rate bluffs in his get to river range. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get an idea of how many value combinations in position has in his betting range on the river. In order to do that, I'm going to click on the bet 657 and I'm going to highlight basically his top pair plus. And I'm basically counting these combinations here manually. It's pretty much the only way to do it that I've found. So I'm going to go 2 and 6.5 is 8.5 plus 3. So we're at about 11.5 combinations. If I go back to the overall range before any bets, I'm going to click back on all. We're seeing that his total range here consists of 40.2 combos. That makes sense because that's what we're seeing here when we add the 24.8 check plus the 15.4 bet. So basically what I'm getting at here is that he's got 26% value in his get to river range that's going to be value betting, and he's got 32% bluffs. It's a good ratio in terms of base rate comparison because it means that he's looking down at more bluffs than value on the river. That he's looking down at more potential bluffs that he could bet than value bets that he can bet, as far as his optimal value betting grid. So what this would indicate is that if he wants to remain balanced, say for like, I don't know, he'd probably have to have 70% value, give or take, in his range when he bets the river. Let's see exactly how much value he's got. So it would basically be like his top pair plus. So it makes up 72% of his river betting range. In order for him to have 70% value when he has less than a 1-to-1 ratio of value to bluffs, he's got to be pretty careful with his bluffing region, his get to river bluffing region. He's got to bluff well under half of them. So that's what I mean when I say it's like a good base rate comparison or a good base rate model in terms of encouraging us to be check calling here on this card. So let's change the card. Let's make it a 10. I've got to take the deuce of diamonds off before I do that. For some reason it's not giving me the spread here, so I'm going to X out of it and go back and just do this manually. Obviously we're not going to get the exact out of position get to river range because again it's playing a donking range, but that's not what we're concerned with right now, so I'm not concerned with it. So here's what we want. Now that we have that, let's look first at what in positions nothing in the low pair is. So we're at 27.8%, which is still pretty high, but not as high as 32. So now what I'm going to do again is head into the betting range, and I've added all of these up, divided it by the total, which at the all was 40.5, and here I've gotten that he has 29% hands that he looks down at on the river that he will be value betting, as opposed to the 27% bluff. So here he's at a little bit more than a 1-to-1 advantage in terms of the value to bluff, so it's a worse base rate comparison. I would have expected to see this spot as a spot where he would have been under bluffing substantially, but a lot of this, as it gets deeper, it becomes more assumptive laden because it hinges on him playing the same type of turn stab that Villain was playing. So if we take a look at Villain's turn stab, he's going out of his way to check back a decent amount of broadways, so this might be something that you build into your assumption. It's something that I think is kind of important, in that if the environment would be more likely to bet all of their queen jack, queen 10, jack 10, mainly those combos I think, for the concern of the 10 river, then at that point I think that our base rate gets even worse on a 10 because he connects more with it. That's something to consider there as sort of leaning one way or the other in terms of building confidence intervals around assumptions, and it's not something that is ever really a consideration on a card like a deuce. So just bringing that up for accountability and so that you guys can explore as intelligently as you think you can make high enough confidence assumptions for what your environment's doing. I tend to think that these broadways would get barreled at a higher rate than what Solver is using here. So I would think that the base rate drop off that we saw that was less advantageous for us than the deuce would look even worse in practice for us for the 10. Let's take a look at like a queen and look at the same thing. So 27% again for nothing and low pair. I've got 12.1 combos here for existing in his value betting range, and I'm going to compare that to his overall combinations in the range, which is 39.7. So what I'm doing on my cell phone right now is dividing 12.1 divided by 39.7, and I'm getting a base rate of 30% value hands that he will be betting when he gets to this river, looking down at this range. So this one is about the same as the 10, and I'm assuming that the jack will be relatively similar. So again, I would gear my bluff catches on this river toward non-Broadway rivers. We can do like an 8. I think that might be interesting to see what the difference is between like an 8 and a deuce. So here it actually looks like it's higher than it was, or I think this was about the same as what it was for the deuce, 32.5. And I'm going to head over to the bet range, highlight the value region, add these combos up. So I get 11.6 when I add up those value combinations, and then I'm just going to divide that by the total combinatoric value of the range, which is 40.1. And I get 29%. So it's about the same, I would say, as it was for the deuce, where he has slightly less value to bluffs as far as the ratio on the river, which is solid for something that we're looking for a good bluff catching spot, I would say. So honestly, if you were to make this tweak alone, where you got more aggressive with bluff catching on rivers where his range didn't interact as well, I would say that that would do a lot for your win rate in itself. And this is just one spot. We're going to look at a couple more. The other thing to keep in mind is that there are certain spots where the runoff will play out in a way where your range becomes significantly less capped. For instance, let's take a look at a spot where the river is a king. This is a spot that I think gets significantly underbluffed in the sense that they're going to put you on a decent amount of king in this line after you check call the turn. So even though in positions looking down at 35.7 bluffs here, I don't even really care what he's value betting in terms of. Looks like he's still value betting a decent amount of top pair in. This is the thing though, I don't think that some would be value betting this thin, which actually probably helps their case for potentially bluffing too often. But for the most part, I think that this is a texture where like I would bypass this process and just go on the basis that the environment will very generally put you on an uncapped range here and think that this is a pretty bad card to bluff, especially if they know that your 1/3 range is depolarized to a lot of king x and that your check call range is pretty king x heavy. So let's take a look at what he actually is value betting here, because he knows we're playing a donking range, which is the other reason that he's probably value betting that ace. It looks like he's still value betting ace queen all in for value. But this would be a spot where I would also recommend like just obscenely overfolding across pretty much all environments, unless I had a lot of metagame with a guy who I thought was trying to like reverse level me. That happens so rarely though that I think your results are just really good to keep in mind when you're overriding this process. And again, I think that's a very high level contextual lace that allows you to always be staying one step ahead of your own conclusiveness, your conclusions that end up being biased when there's other factors in play that are more relevant. So here, if you get a river that, and it probably could work for like the 9 too, since the 9 is in your check call range more than it's in his stab range on the turn, I would be overfolding to those rivers because the environment's interpreting that card as a card that hits your range, gives you trips, keeps you, or makes you uncapped, makes it easier for you to check call, therefore they don't push themselves to use optimal aggression in those spots. So I do think that's a pretty important adjustment or tweak that you can sort of keep up in the corner of your mind, of your thought process, and be like, okay, all things considered, I want to generally use this base rate concept for where I want to be bluff catching, but there are going to be certain rivers where the card interacts well enough with my range that it improves it to the point where it'll probably make villain too paranoid to bluff at an optimal frequency. And I'm looking very carefully into those cards when I make my range versus range interaction decisions. So before we head over to that 3 of diamonds texture, I'm going to show the grid for what we've done with our lock river check for our entire range, and what he's betting and what we end up calling with. So here's what it looks like. We're really well protected here. We're even allowed to fold a certain amount of ace-x. We choose to bluff catch some of the 9x. So usually how I interpret this when I'm in session with my buddies is we'll say something like, alright, well, if we played an absolute check call range in terms of just absolute value, we could push all of this like not shreds of 9-3 suited and 9-8 suited, 9-7 suited up, and 10-9 suited, and we'd probably be defending pretty much the bulk of our top pair. Maybe we'd even be able to fold some slight amount of ace-x, and we'd clearly check call with all of our 2 pair plus. What you'll actually do in practice is, based on the confidence that you have in the range versus range interaction base rate dynamics that are going on, like this was a pretty solid river to be bluffing pretty aggressively on, especially if you think the guy's betting a lot of gutters when check 2 on the turn, like the jack 10, queen 10 suited type region, queen jack. So it might be a spot where I end up overcalling with more of my king x. Maybe it would actually make more sense to call here with like a 9-8 and a 9-7 as a bluff catch, because you don't want to really be blocking the Broadway queen and jack. Then again, the king x probably does have decent removal on. Well, I don't think it does actually, because he never has ace king. He can only have king 9 suited. So I think you're going to get overall better blocker qualities out of the 9-8 and 9-7 here if you want to start bluff catching a little bit too aggressively. So this is the type of stuff that I'm looking at when I'm in modeling, and I'm thinking about how to devise my ranges more about more around exploitative range versus range interaction, as opposed to trying to memorize this exact grid, because from a learning layer, feel into how that really feels so overwhelming and like unsatisfying. That's going to be what you're going to do when you wake up every morning, is come to this grid and try to study the exact frequencies of, looks like 20% 9-8 suited and 10% 9-7 suited. Like, no. And I'm telling you no because I've done that and I've wasted a lot of time with that and I didn't get results from that. And I get results this way by doing it with range versus range interaction, because it comes from a higher order of intelligence on account of the fact that it's coming from a higher order of relevant exploration and relevant emphasis on what the least assumptive way of interpreting environmental trends are. So I guess that's how I want to sort of close that argument, is by saying that the counter argument to what I'm offering with this RVRI interaction for bluff catching would be that somebody could flip it on its end and say, well, since Nick bluff catches more in spots where I have a high base rate of bluffs, I'm going to be over bluffing instead in spots where I don't have as many bluffs to get to the river, and that's how I'm going to exploit Nick. And I would say, yes, that player could potentially exist, but realize how that's a higher assumption that that player is the one that we're gearing our strategy against until he makes himself known or until he produces himself. The much more natural assumption, or the lesser assumption, is that we're dealing with an environment that's more range unaware, and because of that has a natural tendency to over bluff in spots where they look down at more bluffs. So that's how I would sort of defend the RVRI system as far as bluff catching. Not that I think it needs much defense, because I think that it's relatively unchallengeable in nature, in the sense that it is least assumptive, for the very reason I just gave, that you can devise a player who's going to metagame you off of it by reversing the logic of it, but that's a player who makes up maybe 1% of the player pool. So why are we devising our strategy with a paranoia that puts way too much attention on him? I see that with the main problem of the community, like I said, where people do not want to take exploitative strategies because they're worried about being re-exploited, yet they haven't actually tested the waters to see that nobody even understands or cares enough or studies enough to re-exploit them. So it's a major thing that I want you guys to sort of think about and get used to, because your win rate depends on you sort of pushing these types of edges. And from a higher level context, as you move up in stakes and play with better regs, your adaptability depends, and your future win rate depends on you holding sort of an overall awareness of feeling when you're getting sort of played back at by guys, or when guys are sort of leveling the types of systems that they are starting to identify you for, and then you can flip the script on them. So I haven't played a stint at like 510 and 1020 in PokerStars, like I said, but soon I'm going to do that. I'm going to see what these guys are really capable of. And if I put out a new pack, it'll be probably more live play from me, where I'm showing you how I'm like recountering what I think their perception of me is at that time. And that'll be based on a lot of note taking that I do, because a lot of my game is note taking. It's something I moved into after doing range versus range interaction a lot, is that I'm pretty concerned with what my image is, as far as like what bluff catching have I shown down, especially on the anonymous sites, because I know that I'm getting noted up quite a bit. So I want to know what my image is perceived as. And for instance, if on this board, if I had check called already once with like a 9-7 suited, I know that that table is noting me up on the river as like probably a fish who's just like check calling way too wide. But I know that I check called for very advanced range versus range interaction reasons that they don't even understand. So then I'll sort of use that to my advantage, and if I have that note on that table, in the future I'll know that I have sort of check call immunity. Like I don't have to make check calls in the future, because there's a very high confidence rate that those guys at that table have me noted up as a fish, and I'll get to free showdown too often. So stuff like that becomes very relevant at high levels of play, especially on more anonymous sites, but even on sites where you're known for your handle. You just have to, on Zoom it's not as relevant, but if you're playing with the same guys at a 6 max table, like you can start to take notes like this whole table probably just saw me make a crazy call. And again, it's assumptive that they saw you do that, but it's assumptive to say that they didn't. So in the end of the day, you're basically assigning a confidence interval that the rest of the guys at the table saw you show that hand down. And at 1020 Bovada, I noticed that if I did something fishy, the entire table would react to me over the next two orbits. And I saw it happening consistently enough that I just began to assign a very high confidence that if I showed a hand down that was, very off the map in terms of it stands out as fishy, that I would just assume that everybody saw it, and I stayed ahead of the metagame in that way a lot. So these are more, I guess, in-game type laces, and at the risk of going off on tangents, I do think they're highly relevant for lacing your guys' win rate with these types of concepts. So this one's running longer than I wanted it to, but I do want to finish looking at the three that we locked for. So I'm going to do sort of the same thing. Here I'm going to use his more common bet sizing, which is 244, and I'm going to have us calling. The no raise option was locked, and I'm going to start by putting down maybe a queen of hearts. It completes his flushes, which is something that was different from our rainbow king texture. And here again, it's going to have us playing a donking range, but I don't care, because I basically just want to look at his optimal value betting range and what the base rate consists of. So we're exploring in position. He's only got 19.5% king high. I guess if we include the low pair, which we probably should, because we were doing it before, we go to 22.2, which is already lower than anything we've seen so far. I think it'd be interesting to change the queen to a non-flush. Maybe we can do that next. But just as a gist of this, here's his value betting range. It's going to consist of 14.6 combinations, and overall he's looking at 37.3, so I'm doing 14.6 divided by 37.3, and I get a 39% get to river value betting range. So he's looking down at 39% of hands that will be value betting and only 19% of hands, 22.2% of low pair plus. So that's a pretty bad base rate ratio. He's looking at almost 2-to-1 value to bluffs in this spot. Let's change the queen to an offsuit. Back up to 30.8, so it's actually really substantial. Let's also check how much the value range changes, because he's going to come in with less flushes now on the river. He will probably value bet what looks to be thinner though, so it's not the full story. Let's just take that. That was at 31. And for what I'm highlighting here, it's just whatever the thinnest value bet is. Since there's no top pair, I don't need to highlight it. And so I'm doing 11.3 plus 3.7. That's going to be 15. And so I'm taking 15 over the overall 37.7. And again, it's still 39% of the overall get to river range. So it's a better spot to bluff catch substantially because of the fact that he's looking at 39 to 30 as opposed to like 39 to 22 just by changing the queen to an offsuit. So this is cool stuff, and this is stuff that I want you guys to put a lot of time into. You're gonna have to start regimenting, something that you can do with your group mates. For a while what I did was I found a guy who was as interested in this stuff as I was, and we would meet for 2 hours every morning, and it was just a thing. And we did it for like 3 months straight and made some pretty huge gains, and I'm able to speak in this way and make this pack on account of most of the work that I did in that time. So when I say that when you apply yourself relevantly, you can make pretty huge gains in a pretty quick amount of time, I mean that from my own personal experience, and your win rate starts to go up a lot too, and you make a lot of money in the process. So your life gets way better really quick. Pretty excited for you guys. Let's take a look at a 4 river. I think this might be one of the best rivers as far as the base rate ratio in our favor for bluff catching, because I'm pretty sure that his turn bet range doesn't contain much 4x at all. I guess it's got ace 4, but that's going to be 2 pair anyway in other rivers. So really he's just got this shred of 5-4. Also he's got 4s, but again that's going to be a set anyway, and it's actually going to remove some of his set value. So I think that actually helps us in that case, that we get removal on his 2 pair and his sets. So again, I'm going to have him bet the 244. We're going to call. We're bypassing the fact that we're donking because we don't care. It's not relevant. And this is the node that we want to see for Range Explorer. Whoops. So exploring in position. Whether or not we want to do low pair at this point, I think we still do, because it's going to include stuff like deuces. He doesn't really have any 3x in his range, so it's not really relevant. So check this out, 48% base rate. Holler at me for the bluff catch. I mean, I guess I don't even really need to do this because 48% is just killer. But so see here how he's value betting 10.6 combinations of top pairs, so I would start the count there. So it's basically 10.6 plus 3. So I'm looking at about 13.6 divided by an overall 39 combos. So I get 34.7% value, and again he was at 48% bluffs. So I'm almost at like a 1.5 to 1 ratio of bluffs to value in this spot. 47% bluffs, so it's going to make it, or I guess if we include the low pair, we were at 49. It's going to make it pretty hard for him to not over bluff if he's the type of guy who's not very careful and range aware here. Because in order for him to remain balanced, he's probably going to have to check. He's going to have to check, like, I think the vast majority of his bluffs, because he's probably only going to be able to bluff something like between 12 and 15%. Probably more like 12, so he's only going to be able to pull the trigger with like 25% of the overall bluffs he looks down at here on the river, which is like 1 and 4. So this is the type of stuff that I'm really looking for in terms of range versus range. I think that we've done enough procedural work that you guys get the idea, and you get the idea of what you're looking for, and that this is the least assumptive way to start making simplified bluff catching decisions that are actually of a higher order of relevance than memorizing grids. it's not relevant or accurate for me to go into the river bluff catching with the 3 because I haven't resolved it for what would happen when I took the donk out on the river. I'd have to resolve that so we had accurate rangings. But like I said, I'm not really looking at that in the process of my river bluff catching. I think it's good to have a general idea of what your range would look like in terms of if you wanted to meet sort of an optimal frequency of bluff catching. But the reason I say it's not relevant is because you should have enough range versus range understanding and environmental trending understanding that you don't really go to rivers planning on playing optimally. I've said this before that the real high stakes winners that make the mistake of saying that they're playing really balanced, a lot of the win rate they get is from making intelligent range versus range interaction, bluff catching decisions on rivers. And it's not just bluff catching; it's barreling decisions too. Like when we look at the in position single raise pots, we're going to talk about spots where it's worth barreling exploitatively because of the fact that out of position doesn't have a very high base rate of top pair with certain times when he's calling, peeling a lot on certain turns. So it works sort of both ways, and there are ways to exploit it with aggression and also ways to exploit it from this side of it, which is the bluff catching part of it. So I hope that this was precise enough in terms of procedurally, and I know that it's not as texture oriented or grid oriented in terms of toggling through as many turns as maybe we could go through, but I really do think that I have enough that I want to cover in terms of different lines with different procedures that I need to move on because I have to keep this pack around like 5 hours or so. So I'll see you guys back in the next video. And we're going to talk about the last relevant line for this, which is the check check turn line, and then we'll be reopening exploitatively on the river for similar reasons.